Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Aside from me, are there other surviving witnesses to the Bridgeport poltergeist case of 1974? How many kinds of paranormal parasites are there? How old is the human race?
Hello, and welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. This is our 1100th edition, or 1100 and 1101st? I don't know,
1001st.
1001st. See, now we get a little lesson in grammar. Good for all of us. Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you from WOON AM and FM radio here in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live, on YouTube and via TuneIn.com. I'm Ben, and that was Paul, and today, this is the first show of our 16th year, and we bring you open lines to try and answer some of your questions on all sorts of paranormal subjects.
Yeah, a little math. I'm always going round and round with people about this. How old were you, Ben, when you turned 1 year old? How long did it take you to get from birth to 1 year? 1 year.
Yes.
Okay. So people ask, well, wouldn't this be your 15th year? No, when you reach your 15th anniversary, you start your 16th year.
I guess that makes sense.
People gripe about that. So.
I know. Well, mostly Mom.
well, that was only when less said about her age, the better, and mine. But in any case, so let us begin with something rather historic for me that happened yesterday, and that's that for the first time in almost 49 years, I met up with one of the other surviving eyewitnesses of the Bridgeport poltergeist case of 1974, which we've talked about many times on the show, and I've written about several places. That was retired police officer Joseph Tomek, and he happened to be in Uxbridge, Mass., which is right in our listening area. And so we got together. Ben and I did an interview with him for another purpose other than this show, and we had a great visit. Joe told the story of actually interacting with the parasites, or one of them, when he went into a room. Everybody else was out of the house at this point. He went into the master bedroom, and he thought this whole thing was a put-on. The people are trying to fool the police and everybody else. And he went into the master bedroom, and he said, okay, if you're here, do something. And there was a game board with little figures on it next to the bed, and they all started to dance. He said that pretty much sold them on the stuff he'd already seen. TVs moving, refrigerator floating.
Cross getting thrown across the room.
Yep, exactly. And hitting a policeman who refused to come back into the house after.
Oh, yeah.
Not that I
Officer
remember that. Yeah. So in any case, all our best to Joe on Father's Day, and to everyone else. It was really a great, wonderful experience to see him. Hope we'll get together again. He lives in Florida, but it was really great yesterday.
I know, yeah, that was a chance meeting. Didn't expect to see him.
Ben had never met him before.
No, and it just kind of came out of nowhere.
It was kind of spur of the moment.
Yeah, you gave me a call on Friday, and we're like, hey, what are you doing tomorrow morning? And then there was Joe on the other line, like, hey, and I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Because he said he was going to come up later on in the year, like in the winter.
Yeah, somewhere in New England.
Yeah, no, it was a surprise.
Only a few miles from where we live.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Not too far.
Yep. Joe is 84 and going strong. So God bless him.
I know, it looks great.
Yeah. So.
But also, happy Father's Day to you, Dad.
Oh, thank you, Ben.
As it is Father's Day, and you are my father, so happy Father's Day.
Well, thank you very much. We'll go out later and hit a hot dog high spot.
That's all you wanted. We asked what you wanted. You're like, I just want a hot dog.
my hot dog. Okay.
When in doubt, get a hot dog.
So here is a question from Kolya related to that same Bridgeport case.
Mm-hmm. And Kolya writes to us, What did the bird-like parasites' faces look like? Did they have beaks, or did they look like grays, or what? And also, why don't you use the video feed for YouTube? The answer to that is, I don't know, for the second part.
Well, I know.
My dad knows, so
right.
he can answer that.
Well, we'll answer the second one first. The video feed is the copyright property of the studio here. So, but it's eminently available. The link is on our archives page, and it goes into all the link goes into all the audio connections that we have on the apps. So, in other words, if you go into any of the apps, you should see a link to and if you use our show app, there's a link to the video. So it is available, but yeah, I mean, it would be great to put it on YouTube, but we respect the copyright ownership of ON Radio here. So you just go to the site, and there it is. So that's the answer to that. As far as parasites are concerned, in the Bridgeport case, it was really quite a shock for me, because at that point I was 21 years old, studying for the priesthood, and the priests who were there, and Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were with me, or I was with them, were saying that these were demons. And I'd been involved in exorcism the previous year, so yeah, I mean, but ever since my involvement, something wasn't right. I just got the impression that the old ideas weren't good enough. I didn't think they were good enough for ghosts. I didn't think they were good enough for exorcisms to explain that. And I didn't think it was good enough in the Bridgeport house. But what was the alternative? And, you know, like I'm 21 years old, you know, like they're going to listen to me. So on the Monday night of the case, that was the day after I first met Joe Tomek, who was one of the police officers sent to the house who saw all kinds of stuff themselves. I was alone not alone, but in the house with the family. And these things attacked. I've talked about this in umpteen times. There were the kitchen filled with almost like a smoky substance. And Ben and I have a lecture program on time storms, a term coined by the great British researcher Jenny Randall. And this cloud-like electrical stuff seems to be present when there are disruptions in time and space. And I believe some years later, I came to the conclusion that these things we call demons were actually interworld parasites. And that's the process by which they act. And it was a kind of a time storm in that kitchen. 4 semi-translucent figures came out of that kitchen. And I'd gotten the impression the day before that there were 4 entities involved in this case. So they come out of the kitchen. One of them came and stood right in front of me. I knew it was trying to get at the little girl. And I was, this is where I learned the hard way. You do not get angry, frustrated, fearful in the face of these things, because they feed on it, because they're parasites. So I had the physical struggle with it, which threw me for a loop, because these are supposed to be spirits. It got around me and threw Marcy across the room. I could not see a face. The bird-like structure, I sort of deduced from the feel. The thing had a physical body, or at least one that you know, I could push against. And I felt a bone structure that, to me, being a student of philosophy and theology rather than anatomy, seemed very bird-like. And many years later, I found out that the ancient peoples, particularly the Babylonians, were convinced that demons, or whatever they conceived of these things, were bird-like. And maybe that's the reason. Maybe they had similar experiences 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. So, but I did not see the faces, whether they had beaks or whatever. And there are many trickster spirits and gods that are recognized by indigenous peoples, and they will actually wear the mask. Particularly, I saw that in the Yukon by some of the native peoples, First Nations, would wear the bird-like masks. But I did not really see their face. You could just see these. I refer to them as gauzy structures. They're kind of this off-white, and you could see right through them. So that's not a very satisfying answer. But Ben, any comment on?
No, I mean I think it's I get where the question comes from, because it does seem a little, I don't want to say misleading, it's not really the right word, but depending on the frame of mind in which you're listening, it's like, well, I mean, he said there's a bird-like structure, so there should be more to it. But it's
I didn't kiss it, if that's what you mean.
I would hope not.
No.
But I get where the question comes from.
Yeah.
It's a good question, but
very good.
But I think really the more important thing is that, it was the feeling of it, not much the seeing of it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That's kind of the important part.
Yeah. So thank you, Kolya.
Shall we move on?
We shall move on.
Indeed. So we have a question from Christopher, who writes to us via YouTube, leaving a comment. And it's a little bit of a long one, but we'll hop right into it. So Christopher writes, this will no doubt be a polarizing question for some, but Paul, considering that you were studying for the priesthood and were raised in the Catholic Christian faith, what is your view on the whole story around Jesus of Nazareth as far as the ultimate and unique claims put forth by orthodoxy? In other words, the central premise of the Christian faith is not only was Jesus executed by the Roman authorities, but he was also raised from the dead in a manner that allowed him to suddenly appear to people, say, in a locked room. But also he was physical in a way where he could eat a piece of broiled fish given to him by a disciple, so he, going by what written accounts say, wasn't merely an apparition. After a long time of investigating and pursuing truth of all things spiritual and paranormal, what have you arrived at personally?
All right, that's a 25 words or less answer, right?
Right.
I don't want to get into theology here. We do from time to time when it's necessary, and it is relevant to many areas of all areas of the paranormal. I think at the root of that comment and question is the physicality of the resurrection and what Jesus was like, or Yeshua. I think that we're going to have a guest in a couple of weeks who is a Hebrew scholar, who really gets into the proper name of Jesus. I mean, Jesus, and then the name drives me nuts. It's a Latinized name when the Latin church tried to de-Judaize Jesus. De-emphasizing his Judaism, which is terrible. Anyway, whatever you call him, he's my oldest personal friend. But the question, and this was a debate in the early church, was he a ghost? Did he really rise from the dead bodily? What was this about? And there was a big fight about that in the early church. And what won out was the idea of he was totally physical. The whole bit in the gospel where Thomas said, I'll believe it when I see it. Jesus appeared and said, put your hands in my side. See for yourself that it's really me physically. And that's a very important theological point, is the physicality of the human being. It's not just, and a lot of people, in my opinion, in the Western churches, Catholics and Protestants, just don't get it, how important the physicality is, and we stress that in our own work for its own reasons. So I think what that explains why Jesus could rise from the dead, appear and disappear, and eat a meal with his friends, because we're dealing with the big M, the multiverse. Okay? He comes and goes, perfectly physical, just like stuff we've seen right and left, including the parasites in the Bridgeport case that seem to be entirely physical, except you could see through them. So, Ben, maybe you have theological insights, but I think the multiverse idea, God uses his own laws in his own creation. And our whole idea about creation is that it's a product of God's love, which is infinite. Why wouldn't creation be infinite? All possible possibilities, all possible outcomes that can be used to glorify God.
Yeah.
So I think that explains the whole physicality of Jesus after the resurrection. And there were obscure points, I believe it's in Matthew, where the many bodies of the saints, quote, were raised and walked down into the city of Jerusalem. And the whole Lazarus story. But presumably they died again. Jesus, according to the theology, didn't. So, it's all about the multiverse. And why not? What do you say, Ben?
Well, I think it's kind of funny because there's some really interesting accounts of, running into other mythologies around this time when, before it was even called Christianity, it was just like a sect of Judaism at the time. And they were running around talking to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles were like, they had no problem with it. They were just like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, but this guy's a nobody. He's some guy from, from Jerusalem. Who cares, right? He's not a king. He's not a hero.
Well, there was some debate.
Well, it depends on who you talk to, right?
Yeah, it does.
So, if we're looking at, the Greeks, right? They were like, yeah, whatever, sure, cool, yeah, this happens. But it's like, who cares? Who cares about this guy? And it's like, but you have someone who's like Julius Caesar, right? He goes and murders a bunch of people, and they're like, sick, this guy's a god. And so it's like, I think how we look at it nowadays is just heavily enforced by scientific materialism.
Yeah.
And Hegel, right?
Yeah.
And it's just very two-dimensional.
Hegel, the philosopher.
Right. So it's, it's very two-dimensional, very flat, very it turns this idea. There was this really big movement, which if nobody's familiar with it, is called scholasticism. And it was really prominent in the late Middle Ages to, through the Renaissance and really up until now in Europe, right? And essentially the idea was that Christianity was more of an intellectual thing. And it was really postulated by Thomas Aquinas or Thomas of Aquino, depending on how you talk about it, where he basically took Aristotle and then kind of pigeonholed him and used all these arguments to basically create this structure for this very legalistic reality. That was kind of the whole point. And then that ended up, filtering out from there into, pretty much every other intellectual pursuit, especially in Europe, right? And it's heavily influenced a lot of things. And it sort of takes the spiritual and makes it just very flat. And it's reasonable, it's logical, and we can study it, and it's a science. One of the most disturbing things I think that's ever happened was what the Germans did with history, right? Where they came up with this idea where, okay, well, history is a science. And it's not.
No.
History,
not by a long shot.
History is a story. That's what it is. And it's we tell these stories, and that's why it's his story, right? Not a science that you can observe and test. That's just not how it works. But the idea of this, it's heavily infected how we think about the world and how we see it, where we're very abstract from it. We step back and it's well, how can a physical thing happen? That doesn't make sense, and blah 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 blah, because it's how we think about it, right? So there's three really big points, which is, okay, well, what's the point of being a human, right? So before we can even get to, well, what do you think about this guy over here? We have to think about, well, what does it mean to be human, right? What's the whole point? And so from a quote-unquote traditional point of view, the idea is that, we were created to participate in creation with God. That's the whole idea behind it. It's that simple, right? The whole point of us being created in the first place was to participate and assist and to be a part of the creation, right? I mean, we're sitting in a building with, walls and stuff. Would you say we're a part of it?
Of the building?
Well, no, but of creation.
Oh, sure.
We are and we aren't. We build walls and structures to separate ourselves from it, much like how we build walls and separate ourselves from other people. It's the same. It's the same deal, right? So that's number one. What's the whole point of it? Second, what's the point? What is a body, right? What is the purpose of it? What is it? And that's changed drastically. That whole definition has changed drastically over the last couple of millennia. Instead of it, being a meat machine that we just drive, the old ideas of it, if we go back to pre-modern thinking, essentially is, we're sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. We are a nexus of powers and potentialities, which, we gain powers, we lose powers. It's not necessarily limited to physical or spiritual. The border between the two is just, it's fluid, right? It's that idea of Charles Taylor, but the porous self, where, where we delineate ourselves and the world is very fluid. And so it's the same idea, but in sort of a spiritual sense, because it's, we're a nexus of powers and potentialities, and I'll give you examples, right? So, in this instance, right, what was the point of burning stuff in, temples back in the day? What was the point of it?
Well, for one thing, the smoke would arise, and they thought God was in the sky.
Right. But what was the point of burning it at all? What was the point of offering food?
You want the ancient aliens answer?
No, but because that's not, because the whole idea of it is you're participating with an entity, right? You run into a cosmic being, and it's terrifying. What do? You offer it something. It's like someone comes into your house. What's the first thing you do? You offer them something to drink, something to eat, whatever.
Yeah.
Right? So it's the same deal.
That's right.
But the way that these things exist, right, whether it's parasites, whatever you want to call it, they exist in a different dimension than we do, but somehow they can interact with us. And it's the same deal, because, just like we don't know what it's like to be a bat, we do not know what it is like to be angel, demon, parasite, alien, whatever. So we're not really sure how it all works, but for whatever reason, burning stuff seems to do things, because what's the point of smudging, right? What's the point of burning incense? What's the point of candles? I once went to, when I had my mentor was a shaman, right? I went to a little thing where we were doing a sweat lodge, and one of the guys there made a really interesting point, and he was like, every time someone lights up a cigarette, cigar, pipe, whatever, really confuses the heck out of the fire spirits. And I was thinking about that, and I thought about that recently, because at the time I just kind of was like, yeah. But now that I've thought about it, I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting thing to say, because if that's the case, then that's another thing that's interacting with the physical world through these powers, these things that we use to order the world around us. And it's the same deal, right? So how we think about bodies in this instance, right? It's a different power and potentiality that is patterned for us, right? Everybody likes to think that okay, well, Jesus is this enlightened master, and I've heard that definition, and I think it's goofy, because the whole point is we're supposed to follow in the footsteps, and the path's there. It's laid out. You do X, Y, and Z, and you're good. But it's, we make it infinitely more complicated because we as humans like to complicate things.
Yep.
But in reality, it's like the whole point is, okay, cool, I did it, so you can do it too. And that's it. It's that simple. And so with the idea of, okay, what's a body? What's the point? Why is this guy important in the first place? And why does it matter? The reason it matters is, it's not some intellectual pursuit. It's not so. It is a multidimensional thing, in many senses of the word, right? It's a multiversal thing. It's a multidimensional thing. It's not some. It's both incredibly simple, but also infinitely complex that we just we can't possibly understand, because the first step is understanding ourselves and where we fit into the equation, right?
Yeah.
And it's like that with a lot of other spiritualities. The whole point of it is, you understand where you are in the grand scheme of things, and how you fit into the whole with everybody else. Because really, at the end of the day, we're all participating in a story, but what story that is, we don't really know yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. That's probably more than our listener wanted to know. But he wanted to know, I think, also what paranormal work has done to my own faith. I think I stated that clearly at the end of last week's 2-hour special. But in any case, someone's writing in here by text. What's the matter with my voice? Well, I officially have a vocal cord dysfunction. It can be fixed by an operation which ruins your voice. So what's the point of that? Very often it goes away on its own. So that's the problem. I'm not, dying here, I don't think, just yet. So, but thank you for your concern. So and I apologize for the voice. I just take it slowly. Use a lot of throat lozenges and I get through. So who's next there, Ben?
Well, I think now is about time for us to take a break. Yeah,
okay.
I know. Time flies when you're having fun.
Indeed.
So you're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on our first show of our 16th year. There you go, Dad.
Yep.
And happy Father's Day to all, and we'll be right back.
Casey Kasem has unlocked the American Top 40 vaults and is replaying original shows from the 80s. This week, Casey takes you back to June 21st, 1986. That's when Belinda Carlisle was mad about you. Whitney Houston found the greatest love of all. Simply Red was holding back the years, and the Jets had a crush on you. You'll hear those songs, all the top 40 hits, and the long-distance dedications from June 21st, 1986, right here on American Top 40, the 80s.
You can depend on us for public service, ON Radio.
Welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno here on WOON AM radio and FM radio. That's 1240 AM, 99.5 FM here in New England's kind of, I won't say hot, but we'll say warm Blackstone River Valley here. And we are jumping back into our open line show, our first of our 16th year. And we're going to take another follow-up question from Christopher, which is on a completely different subject, now for something completely different. And he writes to us, Paul, you mentioned that you have arrived at 9 different types of parasites. Would you mind elaborating on that, please?
Oh, sure. Well, I have here and there, but and it's spelled out in my last book, Dancing Past the Graveyard. But we'll go through all of them here. I am written down to make sure I don't mix them up. We start with the top shelf, which is the wise. And I started to refer to them as the wise, not because they're wise in any sense of wisdom, but they're very, very wise in the ways of their own people, shall I say. I think these are not demons. They fill the bill and they deserve the label, but they are multiversal creatures who feed on our energy and the energy of other things going on in other parallel worlds. We've in a number of cases run into, and I have before Ben joined me, running into, particularly in Vermont, a case where something was going on in a parallel world that was feeding the parasite, and it would come into our world across what a physicist would call the membrane in order to get more to eat. In that particular case, there was, we believe, a fight or a murder going on in some parallel reality, and there was a police officer who lived in a basement apartment. And when the parasite, in our opinion, couldn't get enough to eat from the what was feeding on the other world, would come and go into the apartment. And he said whenever his fiancée and he would fight, the thing they could see it running around the apartment, knocking stuff off shelves and all that. The last member of the Wise that I dealt with, I believe, was in 1998, and that was here in Rhode Island. And this one had its victim, its host, convinced that it was a lover from a former life. The woman was writing love poems to it, and you wouldn't believe this stuff. But I saw it for what it was, and we dealt with it accordingly. So that's the Wise. There are also the Elders. They also seem to have great knowledge and experience in the ways of their own kind, and they can be found working together. The Wise, I've found, tend to work alone. The Elders tend to be leaders among their own kind, because various kinds of parasites will sometimes be seen working together, some dominating others. There are the farmers. These seem to work quietly, groups of 4 to 8, and they will literally farm a family for the energy food value for sometimes generations. I ran into that in San Diego, where there was a case with a family of Italian extraction, and they all not only had attachments that went back 3 and 4 generations, but the women in the family were highly psychic. Not that there's necessarily a connection, but I've often found people who practice mediumistic practices will very often have attachments of this kind. Then there are the pack hunters, highly aggressive, highly provocative, stirring things up so they can push your buttons in order to eat. They work in groups of up to 6. I had a really amazing case with them. It was a crazier poltergeist situation than the Bridgeport house. And this was 1979 in New Haven, Connecticut. So they're very good mimics, the pack hunters. You might hear someone you love very much in their own voice calling you a nitwit or something worse. And very often they can use that sort of technique. There are the rogues as well. These are loners, and they have some of the tendencies, of pack hunters. The rogues very often will manifest when you use sledgehammer techniques, like Ouija boards, things of that kind. I suspected that the exorcism case I talked about many times and that I wrote about in Dancing Past the Graveyard was actually a rogue in the Barbara case of 1973. There are the passives. The passives are kind of second stringers, very often dominated by the elders or others, and they will kind of feed on the crumbs from the tables of the most powerful parasites. There are the lost, and this is a really fascinating tendency among parasites, particularly the lost, is that the longer they spend attached to a human host, or in our world, or presumably any other, the more they tend to forget that their own origins. I'm thinking particularly of the Bell Witch case in Tennessee, 1817 to 1821, which I was given access to some primary sources on that. And people would come, because they heard about it, from around this county, Robertson County, and they would talk to the parasites. And one of the things they asked was, what are you? Where did you come from? And the parasites didn't seem to remember, but they said they had Native American connections and had been in the area for centuries. So that was the lost. Very interesting. They would also tell hilarious jokes. Go figure. There were the tricksters, well known in just about every tradition, particularly in indigenous peoples. They can play cruel jokes, pranks, and they are well known. Could be responsible for some poltergeist activity. There were the brats, kind of the bottom half. They are two-dimensional thinkers. One of the most prominent cases of a brat parasite that I dealt with was some years ago, having to do with a prominent artist in New York City. And I can't tell you the name of the artist, but this brat was attached to this person for 25 years or more, would throw the person down the stairs, all sorts of things. Very, very upsetting. And then there are the lost and frightened, of course, but the brats are the bottom shelf. So that's pretty much the rank and file of the parasites there.
Lovely.
Yeah. Again, apologies for the voice.
No, you're doing the best you can, Dad. With what you got.
Thanks, Ben. That's a backhanded compliment.
I'm not trying to make it a backhanded compliment. I'm very
I know.
sorry.
That's fine. I know.
No, it gives you character.
Well, you can take the next question. I
can't.
sound like Don Corleone.
Yeah, I could see. You come to me. Let's see. I need.
Oh, okay.
Need the next set of questions.
Sticky here.
Oh yeah, it's that time of year, unfortunately, where everything gets sticky.
Yeah.
So we have a question from. Oh boy, we do love a good French name, and I apologize. I will butcher it.
Let me see it. La Baccarel.
There we go. La Baccarel writes in. Regarding the last question with these ancient buildings, it's important to consider that during the Ice Age, sea levels were approximately 200 feet below the current levels due to the amount of water stored in the glaciers. This exposed much more land for moving materials and very likely made the migration into the Americas possible. It didn't quite get the location of the site I didn't quite get to the location of the site mentioned, but if it's in the southern Asian area, I'd be looking around for ancient volcanoes as a site of basalt. We don't need to bring in aliens to solve this mystery, but should definitely keep in mind that sea levels varied over time, which is true. A sudden rise in sea levels, as Graham Hancock postulated, would have given rise to the story of the Great Flood. If the sudden rise was due to a comet strike, this would have also been the source of the belief that comets were signs of impending disasters. Early man may have not been as mechanically advanced as we are, but their oral histories were phenomenal in recording their past.
All right, that question referred to our last open line show when we had a caller who asked about Göbekli Tepe and another site in, I believe, it was South Asia, as the reference was, and that we would, they wanted to sort of comment on that. The point being that results of digs that archaeology really can't get around is starting to push the history of the human race farther and further back. So Göbekli Tepe, 10 to 12,000 years old. Apparently they had systems of communication of some kind. There were animals depicted that on columns that don't exist anymore. So this is really cool. Yeah, I mean, I think the man has some points. As far as the story of the flood is concerned, there are many accounts of that from many cultures all over the world. There are also many explanations for it that have been postulated. One is that if there was a quick shift in the poles, now as we know, the magnetic north is shifting. It's somewhere down in the Northwest Territories now. But sometimes if the Earth actually shifted its actual axis, is possible. And there are some theories that has happened. The oceans would literally kind of slosh out of their basins, wash over the continents, and then recede again. I don't know if any kind of sea rise other than that, a quick sea rise, could create a flood situation globally other than the one I just described. So, what say you, Ben?
Well, I think there's a really interesting dimension to water in general. And, you know, there was a really interesting lecture I listened to forever ago that talked about the importance of water in ancient cultures. And, you know, you'd think it's some anthropological thing. Well, duh, yeah, they drink it, it's important. But no, symbolically, water stood for chaos. And there's a really interesting reason why you see in ancient documents, you know, when they mention water or they mention, you know, anything that has to do with streams or rivers and boats, right? The reason boats were important was you're treading the chaos, right? You know, you can even look at it in a sense that's like, you know, if you kind of take your life into your own hands when you go on a boat, right? Because the sea is so chaotic. But in a sense, there's this idea that the chaos of water was something way more significant, especially when it comes to these ancient flood narratives, right? The idea is that there was chaos everywhere, right? You know, even if there was, you know, we'll say there's a really important portion of ancient writings I think everybody forgets about here in the modern world, where, yeah, sure, there was a physical aspect to it, but there was also many layers to whatever people were experiencing. And so, you know, sure, yeah, there was a flood. There's evidence of it. We know that there was that. But you have to look at the other applications of it as well, right? You know, it's, sure, yeah, okay, well, you can take it and say, well, you know, they tacked on a mystical thing to it, blah, 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 because they were idiots, and they didn't have science. And it's like, well, they were idiots. They wouldn't have built civilizations.
Exactly.
So
they wouldn't have survived at all.
Right. Well, it's selective intelligence, I think, is kind of the word. You know, if Romans were idiots, they wouldn't have built buildings that last longer than our highways.
Right.
Right? So it's like...
highways don't last long at all.
No. So so I think that there's a distinct... I think that there's a blind eye that's turned to a lot of it, especially in an anthropological sense, because we like to think we're the smartest ones. Honestly, I think we're the dumbest ones, personally speaking. Because it's just like you know, you look back and it's like, you know, how did they do all of this? And you know, we're learning how, and there's really interesting ideas and stuff, and it's like, well, you know, the easy explanation is, aliens did it, and it's like, that's not really fair. I think because people had less distractions, they were able to come up with really ingenuitive, you know, solutions to problems. And you know, how do we, you know, move these giant rocks to build these giant pyramids? And so then the other point is, why would they build pyramids at all? You know, what was the point of it? And I think that there's all these questions and layers to it that, you know, we have this whole our 19th century German friends who ruined history for us, where they kind of just were like, well, everything was practical, and then they tacked on, you know, the mystical stuff at the end. You know, that was just something they added on because they were bored or dumb. And that's not really the case, because a lot of it was centered around that. You know, just because there was a giant flood, right, and definitely multiple, you know, mini ice ages throughout history that we're learning about as time goes on, doesn't mean that there weren't other implications to it throughout reality.
Well, there is a point that scholars and a lot of other people patently fail to appreciate, and that's that history, especially as it gets pushed further and further back, can indicate something other than just, pushing it back or ancient aliens. There's a third possibility, which is cyclical history as opposed to linear history. And the metaphor I always use is that we may have gone from stone tools to power tools as many as 4 times in this million years of empty history that the human race has had. This is indicated when we had Professor Cremo on the show a few weeks back, a few months back. He was he's written books about forbidden archaeology. I don't know who's forbidding it, but mainstream archaeology doesn't accept some of the more bizarre artifacts that come from a lot of areas around the world that where you find stone quarrying tools from 500,000 years or even more that go back and they kind of look like our tools. It's very possible that advanced civilizations arose, advanced in the sense of technology, and were destroyed by wars, asteroid strikes, other natural disasters, such as the floods we've been speculating about. So I think that certainly that's something that has to be considered, that knowledge from prior quote-unquote advanced civilizations was carried over by tradition or literature in some way, so that the next civilization, which we would consider primitive, could build pyramids, move enormous stone blocks by sonic technology or whatever. I mean, if we were obliterated tomorrow and the human race survived in small numbers, there would eventually certainly be traditions carried on of us flying around in airplanes, cars, building cities, things of that kind. And I think that's a very strong possibility of how it worked.
Yeah, I mean, I just saw something too, and that reminded me of it. It was some mine that got discovered. I think it was a silver mine or gold mine or something. That
always watch the mines.
Yeah,
interesting stuff.
And it dated. They managed to figure out that might have been the one that was mentioned in the Mines of Solomon or something.
Oh yeah.
I saw something pop up on like my goofy little Microsoft news feed thing, and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Speaking of that, because I think it's like all this stuff's been around forever, and and there's a really fun sort of different dimension to the idea of cyclical history, which is, all the stories that pretty much any civilization tells all kind of have the same tropes. Mm-hmm. And it's just, they're just repeated over and over and over again.
Yeah, pretty much everywhere.
Right. And the idea is that there's a universal history, quote unquote, is the name of the theory, that really all the same sort of tropes happen and they all point to the same conclusion. It's kind of interesting to think about, because it does kind of illuminate a lot of things, like like the story of King Arthur, being similar to like other sort of coming of age stories, or like some people have even said that it's kind of like a English creation story almost, or like a northern creation myth. Like Beowulf, all those things, and it's interesting because each sort of civilization kind of has their own sort of thing that's theirs, and it's unique. It's unique. Its themes and stuff are unique to their culture, but the overall sort of tropes and continuous symbols are all very similar across the board. We point to it now and just say, well, it's everybody just thought the same things, and they're all idiots, but it's like, it's not really that. It's like, the point is that the human experience isn't really. It's not. Well, the human experience is mutual, right?
Yeah.
Everybody kind of experiences the same stuff, whether we like to admit it or not. And it's we all try to find ways of ordering it and understanding it. If that makes sense.
Yes. I'll go you one better. It's entirely possible that particularly with the panspermia theory, which holds a lot of water for a lot of cosmologists, that life spread all over to hospitable planets, even some of them are not hospitable, and that if and when we encounter civilizations out there, they may have similar traditions. They may have been an original colonizing civilization. They may have similar belief systems, particularly if the life experience on their planets was the same. There is a theory that sounds pretty wild, but it's becoming increasingly respected in some circles, that our species really originated on Mars when it was a watery planet, which obviously it was, because explorations there were found that it was, and that one of the interesting things is that when astronauts are in space, nobody's gone to Mars yet lately, but when they're in space, they go to their bodies cycle to not to a 24-hour day, but like a 25-and-a-half-hour day.
Jeez.
Which is exactly the length of the... I may be wrong about the exact measurement, but it shifts to the Martian day as opposed to the terrestrial day. That says something. So, again, as we're always saying, it's the first day of school.
Yeah, truly.
So, who knows?
Yeah.
So let's get off our high horses.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Nobody asked that question, man. We brought it.
Well, you didn't ask for it, but you got it.
Yep.
Well, we're coming down to the
oh,
wire
yeah,
here.
okay.
Yeah, we only have about 3.5 minutes left.
Okay.
So we can hop into our announcements and kind of
Let's
take
do
our
that.
time with it if you'd like.
Sure.
Because the next question is, it's a short one, but it's got a long answer to it and has to do with reincarnation. So we'll get to it next time.
Yeah.
So you can look for us at the Exeter UFO Festival on Labor Day weekend. That's in September. That's September 2nd and 3rd. We plan to do our traditional show from there with a live audience on September 3rd. And the Greater New England UFO Conference is back. This is a one-day event. That's on November 4th in Leominster, Massachusetts. And you can watch out for more information on that. And you can also visit our show website. That is BehindTheParanormal.com, where you can find nearly 1,200 hours of our regular shows, special broadcasts since 2008 from CBS Radio and Achieve Radio, and here on WOON AM and FM. You can also hear many of these broadcasts on the major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and you can find our 1,000th show there as well.
Yeah, there was a 2-hour special. There is divided into 2 audio files, the first hour and the second hour. But if you come to ONWorldwide.com or OneSocketRadio.com, the whole 2 hours is in the video. And people are asking about videos. We have a link to that.
Now you get to see my
as well.
My mug on there as well, and everybody else. That was a lot of fun. That was a really good show.
That was really a tremendous response to that.
Indeed.
Download our show app. It's free at BehindTheParanormal.com. And browse our books along with those of our guest co-hosts.
And our show website has a charity page with links to several good causes we've adopted over the years, including Hope for Hilldale Cemetery in Haverhill, Massachusetts, USA Cares, Canadian Veterans Advocacy, Helping Haiti's Orphans, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, the Sisterhood of Ground Zero, and most recently a GoFundMe page for the folks in East Palestine, Ohio, site of the recent train wreck and chemical fire.
Okay, so what's going on next week, Ben? Take the second one.
Yes. So on June 25th, we'll bring you an open line show to... the second one. I'm sorry. So
that's
we're going to do more open lines. More. We're going to welcome Steve Bassett, a true tip of the spear when it comes to UFO disclosure.
Because we don't agree on much, so probably some fireworks. But we love Steve.
We do love Steve.
We leave you today with a thought from Belgian-American psychologist Esther Perel. Mystery is not always about traveling to new places. It's about looking with new eyes. I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno. And thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey and our first show of our 16th year. And we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.